So you've worked with offenders in secure hospitals and then adolescents and now the prisons. So what led you, to in this field in the first place?
I didn't necessarily know that I would be working with offenders. I trained to be a mental health nurse, so that's you go to university, you have to study, you have various different placements within mental health. I sort of ended up in all of this by accident, really. So I did my nurse training. I was in my mid-20s. And for my early 20s, I was a bit of a, in my early life, I took the typical route. Went to school, went to college. Went to university, dropped out after a year, wasn't for me, didn't work out, and then I was kind of working dead-end jobs, really. Not quite sure what I wanted to do. And I was big into martial arts. I was like quite a decent level kickboxer at that time, doing various different things. But obviously you can't do that forever, So I was like, well, what do I do in my life? What am I going to do? And I was working I was a forklift truck driver. I worked in factories. Often worked in like agencies, like be here, be there, different places, and there was people who worked for the agencies who also worked on agencies on nursing wards. So I ended up on nursing wards, and it was through some of the conversations that I had with some of the staff there. And there was one person in particular, and he was like, I don't know, he was asking me about myself. It was a quiet morning. We were just talking about this and that, and he was like, well, you need to be a nurse, you need to get into this. I didn't even know what it meant. I didn't really understand it as being nursing. When you think of a nurse, you typically think of like a physical health nurse, wound cares, dressings, that sort of thing. But he talked me into it. So I was like, okay, what do I do? So I applied. And I was lucky enough to get in. So I did a 3-year course in mental health nursing. I didn't know at that point I would be working with offenders. You do various different placements, so it could be things like dementia care. It could be what they call general acute wards, where people might turn up at A&E and they're mentally unwell. They get sectioned. They go into a general hospital. You have community services. You have various different things. But it just so happened that one of the placements I have, the course is a combination of like written work, assignments, practical work that you do at the university, and placements. And I had a placement that I really got on with and really enjoyed, and that was in a secure hospital. So that's kind of where I decided I wanted to go. And I was lucky enough that one of the people who was working there at the time, he was like, you've done well. I liked it, so I was, if you like it, you work harder, don't you? So I enjoyed it. And he was like, he pretty much said to us, if you want to come back, let me know, and I'll help you with applying and all that sort of stuff. And so that's where I ended up going. So I worked in secure hospitals. In the secure hospitals, it's a combination. So sometimes it's offenders, people who've come from prisons, and sometimes it's people from other mental health hospitals where they've got a high level of aggression, a high level of violence. They can't safely manage them.
So do you deal with those people, the violent ones as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of, this isn't in my job currently, but in that job, sometimes, you learn restraint techniques, for example.
Yeah.
Because sometimes that's the only way that somebody can be safely managed without, someone getting hurt. They might be, they're striking out, they're trying to hurt somebody, potentially trying to hurt themselves. And so you learn to safely manage those physical confrontations as well. You try and avoid it, obviously. As well as that, you learn a lot about what they call de-escalation, talking people around, and that's the most effective thing.
And I think that's where the jiu-jitsu, the Brazilian jiu-jitsu, actually comes very much in handy.
I think so.
And we'll get to that later on. Yeah. And but I mean, as well as maybe decompressing, after work, because obviously you deal with a lot of mental strain during the day.
Yeah.
So how did working with adolescents, compare for you to working with the adults on mental health?
It was different in some ways, it was similar in some ways. So the adolescents that we worked with, it was a similar kind of trajectory to ending up in a mental health hospital. So we would take people from young offenders institutes, so like younger prisons, within the prison system, obviously under 18s, and within most systems, under 18s are separated from adults. There's lots of kind of legal requirements for that kind of things. So we would have people come from the young offenders institutes, but we would equally have people coming from adolescent hospitals where they couldn't be safely managed because of their level of violence and aggression. The main difference, I think, for adolescents was that you would have, firstly, there was a lot more input from a lot more areas. You know, you try and rightly so, you try and get in there early with younger people in terms of kind of recovery and rehabilitation and getting people off that pathway. Also, there's just a lot more people involved because there's things like educational departments, social work, that sort of thing. Day to day, young people are livelier typically, you know, so there was a lot of that sort of thing. Working with adults, you would have a combination of kind of young people who were very new to that system, but you would also have people who've been in the system for a very, very long time, and obviously their kind of take on these things would be quite different. Working with adolescents, everybody's quite new in there, everybody's young, you don't get the same kind of lifer mentality, I suppose, like you get in some places. You get
so they're a bit more violent, maybe? They can
be. I mean, when I was first there, this was when I was working with adolescents, when I started there, it was quite wild. It was pretty wild. I think it was just a time and a place. I don't think it was always like that all the time, but certainly when I started, it was really difficult to manage. You know, a lot of young people together, a lot of very, very difficult characters, quite a limited staff team. You know, the NHS is everywhere. You know, staffing issues is a big thing, and that can obviously have an impact where if you've not got enough people to safely manage things, it can be dangerous.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it can be dangerous.
And after 2 decades in this care, this mental health, how have things changed over the years towards you guys and the staff?
Good question. I suppose a lot of the changes for myself have not necessarily been through the time, and the cultural changes. A lot of it is because I've worked in different places, so it's hard to comment from one place to another. I suppose when I first started, things were a lot more restrictive for the patients. A lot more limitations, very, very strict rules that were very, very closely adhered to. Now it tends to be a lot kind of more patient focused, more individually focused, kind of, rather than like this is rule and everybody needs to keep to it. You try and individually manage it. Patient-centered care, they call it, and that applies to everything. So trying to do it in the right way for them. There's pros and cons with that. It's very, very difficult if you've got 15 people to manage them all on an individual thing, because what people need individually can often be quite varying, and then you get disparities like this person's got this person's got that, and then it's difficult to manage the whole environment. That isn't the work that I do now, but that's some of the changes that they make. Things used to be a lot more restrictive. Some of that was good, some of that was bad. I would say that things were safer for the nursing staff back then.
And Strangeways was placed under strict measures due to drugs and violence and poor conditions. So how do you
from the recent inspections?
Yes. So I mean, you know, how do you work with mental health in such an environment?
It's tricky. I mean, we are quite involved in everything. So we see everybody that comes into the prison, regardless of their background and history. Every prisoner that comes in, they're seen by various different departments. So the mental health team is one of those. And we do a bit of an assessment, I suppose, when they first come in. Most people then, they don't work with us any further than that. As in the same way most people in the community don't work with mental health teams. But a lot of people do. And so we might have to do more thorough assessments, and then we kind of decide on how people are working, what people need and who they're going to be working with from that point of view. In terms of the things you've just mentioned, the recent inspections, the issues with the drugs, the issues with the violence, it's very tricky. I mean, we're not directly involved in that in the sense that we don't directly manage the violence. Obviously we've witnessed it and we've heard about it, and we deal with the aftermath of that quite a lot of the times, you know. But it's tricky. It's a tricky environment, you know. Prison is obviously very, very difficult. I think all of the inner city prisons have real difficulties with the drug issues. I don't think they're very well set up in terms of the way in which drugs come into the prison now. It's very, very sophisticated. Drones.
And what is the drones as well?
Yeah. And a lot of the prisons are, so for example, where I work, it's a 19th century prison in a 21st century environment. So a lot of the setup just isn't there. The prisons that from what I understand of it, the prisons that have the best management of things like drugs, they're in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
You know, they're in the countryside, 100 miles from the nearest town. You know,
what's a popular drug that what's the most popular?
The most popular drug's probably spice. Spice is common. Ketamine is common. I'd say they're the main two. It doesn't tend to be things like cannabis.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, cannabis is probably there, but it's probably just less known about because the impact of it is a lot less. You know, spice is obviously very, 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 very serious, very, very dangerous. But those are the things that we hear about the most.
And how do you think the drugs affect somebody who's mentally ill as well, and then smoking spice?
It's a real problem. It's a real problem. People can become people without even a history of psychosis can become psychotic because of their drug use.
Wow.
Yeah. You know, I've seen that happen. People end up coming under our teams where they don't have that mental health history because of the drug use. It's a very, very difficult environment, and I think the thing is there is a drugs team within the prison, so there's a specialist team working specifically to help the addicts. There's obviously security measures to try and prevent the drugs from coming in. There's a specific wings in the prison where the idea is that they are drug-free, substance-free. If you're in recovery, that's kind of where you go to for your recovery problem. As if you were, in the community and you were going to like a rehab. So there's like a rehab area and then a longer-term drug-free wing. But there's no guarantees for these things, unfortunately. Unfortunately, they sometimes still get on there.
Yeah.
You know,
it's reported that 45% of prisoners, suffer from anxiety and 8% psychosis.
Yeah.
So how does this, facts like how does that impact your practice?
Those are a lot of the people that we work with. That's a lot of our caseload, I suppose. I'm surprised it's as low as 45%, quite frankly.
Yeah.
You know, because it's an anxiety-provoking environment. You know, obviously, prisons are difficult places. You know, it's a tough environment. In a certain sense, anxiety is probably a logical response to the environment that you're in. You've got lots of good reasons to be anxious. You know, so it doesn't surprise me. In terms of how it works within the systematically, somebody with anxiety, if they had a primary problem of anxiety, they would be seen through what we call the primary care team. So that's kind of GP led. In the same way that if you were out in the community and you had an issues with anxiety, you might go to your GP. They might prescribe you anti-anxiety medication. You might have a bit of a program to manage the anxiety. And as part of our team, we have a therapy team, and part of that program is like things like anxiety management, CBT, that sort of thing. CBT in terms of talking therapies and non-medical therapies, CBT is one of the kind of the standard interventions, and so we have people who do that sort of work within our team. So that's not what I do, but I have colleagues who that's their job to help people manage their anxiety.
And what does a typical day look like for a mental health nurse in the HMP Manchester?
So there's a bit of a schedule, I suppose. The day, one of the things I like about it is that it's not as routine as that. It's very, very varied. But a typical day, our team, we work from 8 in the morning till 6 in the evening. That's the hours that we're there. So the first part of the day, you come in, and then it depends on we have various different responsibilities. So you have somebody who they call it duty. So it's a little bit like the person who's in charge that day. So they will kind of plan the day out for the team. We'll have lots of kind of tasks and jobs that have come in either overnight or over the week, and so they kind of need to be organised. So the person who's the duty worker, they will organise and then allocate out the jobs that need doing that day. We have a mental health nurse on call. So that's kind of through a radio system. We call it through a radio system, so that you could be radioed at any time to kind of go to wherever you need. If somebody on the wings has allocated you that. We then have lots of different, within the prison, most organisations nowadays, but within the prison especially, most things are done in a kind of multidisciplinary manner. And so the nursing team, the mental health nursing team end up being part of that MDT. So you might have various kind of different meetings, risk issues, that sort of thing. A lot of what the duty worker, it's called, their day after they've kind of allocated out the jobs that need doing is going to what are called ACT reviews. So an ACT review is kind of management of self-harm. So obviously that's something that the mental health team will attend with, and again that's done multidisciplinary. There'll be like a senior prison officer, somebody from, often people from various different teams within the prison there, and so they'll go and do the reviews for that. You might have people that you've got to see for like assessments. You might have people that you need to see. On top of all of those things, everybody on the team, all of the nurses, you have what's called a bit of a caseload. So you might have about 20 or so people who are under the care of a nurse regularly. So this is kind of, our team is kind of equivalent to a community mental health team. So if you were a community mental health nurse, you'd have your caseload and you kind of go out to see them. You go out to see them wherever they are and see how they're doing and see if they're taking the meds, see how they're coping, see if they're taking drugs and that sort of thing, obviously things that might be potentially detrimental. And then you're kind of talking things through, evaluating how they're doing, maybe doing bits of what they call psychoeducation, like, well, you know, how's this impacting your mental health? How's this impacting your functioning? That sort of thing. So that's a really long answer because it's really varied depending on what you're doing, what your day will look like. In terms of the structure of the day, over most days we will have, like I said, it's quite a varied team, our team. It's not just nurses, there's psychiatrists, there's therapists, there's lots of different people. Over lunchtime, we kind of meet and have our team meeting, discuss various different people that we're seeing, different issues that need addressing, that sort of thing. So in the morning, we'll kind of do our organising. Then we're going out and seeing people. Then over lunchtime, we kind of come back together, have our meeting. Then in the afternoon, again, we're out and we're seeing people. And then the last couple of hours are basically spent on the laptop, on the computer, writing up everything, because obviously you need to record everything that you do.
Can you share a time where you felt emotionally or physically at risk, and then how did you handle it?
That's happened a lot less in my current job than when I worked on the wards. One of the things I will say about the work that I do, although it often sounds to people like it might be more dangerous, more risky, I actually feel like it's safer. And the reason for that, I think, you're not directing the firing line, so to speak, when a serious incident happens, unless it's directed at you. And in terms of the relationship, the feel amongst the prisoners, generally speaking, I think we're quite highly thought of by the prisoners. They know that we're just there to help them and support them. When I worked on wards, you were there to help and support them, but you were also there to sometimes stop them from doing things that, you were there to kind of manage things in a way that now is done more so by the prison officers and the prison system. I've been involved in things like restraints, risk incidents, that sort of thing. And it's a funny sort of thing. I mean, when I used to be involved in restraints, it was obviously very, very nerve-wracking, quite scary. But what I used to find, and this is probably just a bit of a personal thing, but once you're actually in you get a lot of training for these things. You get a lot of training for these things, and if it's a regular part of your job, whatever's a regular thing for you to do, you sort of get more accustomed to it, I suppose, more skilled, I'd like to think. And so the further I got into my career, I found less at risk because I felt like, you could spot things early, you could manage situations a little bit better. You wouldn't ever want to get to the point where you felt like you knew it all and you could do everything. You certainly wouldn't want to get cocky or conceited about it. And I realised that could sound a bit cocky and conceited, but as you become more accustomed to situations, you kind of get a little bit better at these things.
Have you ever had death threats in there?
Oh yeah. And not where I am so much, but you do get threats occasionally, and you get more kind of, you shit, you're a dickhead, that sort of thing, rather than death threats. But you do sometimes get them. You do sometimes get them, and it's a difficult thing. I think you need a thick skin. You need a thick skin in the job, and you also, I suppose, when you're working with people with mental health difficulties, it can often, for most people with serious mental health difficulties, aren't violent people, are more likely to be at risk from others than actually risky to other people. However, that wasn't really the cohort that I've worked with. I tend to have worked with people who were risky to others, and that's why they were in secure hospitals. That's why they're in prison, because they've done, you know, dangerous and violent things. So I would often work with people who were violent, who were threatening. You work together as a team. You wouldn't ever, if you felt a threat, you would never be isolated with that person. You know, there's things you can do to mitigate it. And like I said earlier, the thing that works, that's the most effective is what they call the de-escalation, talking to people, talking things through, trying to have the conversation, and that goes a long way. That goes a long way. But it's not without its risks, and it could never be entirely without its risks. You know, I've been assaulted. I've had to take time off work because of assaults. You know, that's a very real thing.
Now, obviously, violence and drug use is rife in the prison. Now, I mean, how does the drug use, you know, compound on the mental health? I mean,
it makes things worse. It certainly makes things worse. There are a lot of people who probably wouldn't have to work with mental health teams if it wasn't for the drug use. But it's a complicated thing. It's a very complicated thing. The two are quite closely intertwined. So you get people who develop mental health problems because of their drug use. You get people who use drugs because of their mental health issues. So you often call it, one of the phrases that's sometimes used is self-medicating for drug use. So people might use drugs as a coping mechanism because of the mental health issues, because of the difficulties they faced in their life, you know, as a way of just kind of blotting it all out. To cope with the stress of the environment. There are lots of people who use it to kill time, because prison, if you're a prisoner in prison, as well as being very stressful, it's also probably very, very boring, you know. So sometimes people use it to, you know,
it's to kill time.
Yeah, to kill time, you know.
And what support is available to these people?
So there's a dedicated drugs team. There's a dedicated drugs team and a dedicated drugs wing. So they work closely with people. One of the things, I suppose, is that all of the services that are available specifically in prison is they're sort of opt-in. So you can't, as much as you'd love it to be the case, you can't make somebody engage if they don't want to. You certainly can't make somebody stop using drugs if they don't want to. And even if they do want to, addiction's such a powerful thing.
Oh yeah.
It's such a powerful thing. I mean, one of the analogies that often gets said to me, you know, for people who do use and they're trying to stop, but it's there, they will often talk about, you know, well, if I was trying to stop drinking, I'd stay out of the pub. You know, if I was trying to lose weight, I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't have cakes in the house. You know, those sort of examples. It's super difficult to stop using if things are around you. I wish it wasn't, and I don't want to be critical of the prison of it, because it's not like the prison aren't trying to manage this. Of course they're trying to manage this, but it's incredibly difficult. There's a lot of people in prison who are in prison for drug offences, you know, and are very, very good at getting drugs into places, you know, and so obviously that applies a lot of people. If you're a drug dealer, and that's your background, and that might even be your offending history, you can very easily carry that on within the prison walls.
And what are the biggest differences treating people in hospital compared to prison?
I suppose the main difference is that there's really different legal frameworks. So in the way that I've said that in the prison things are buy-in and opt-in, in hospital it's less so. So you can enforce treatment, for example. You can, and by that I mean, like literally you can, you know, if it's been authorised and agreed and thought to be necessary and the safest course of action, you can restrain people and inject them with medication that they don't want to take. You know, if that's that's something you try to avoid, but that's something you can do in hospital that you can't do in prison.
Is that like in the films where they tackle them down and inject them? I mean, what do they normally inject them with?
So there's antipsychotic medications.
Right.
So if somebody is very, very unwell, they are, you know, they're experiencing things that aren't real. They might be seeing and hearing things that aren't really there. They might be have you know, hearing voices.
Schizophrenia.
Yeah, absolutely. That sort of thing. That sort of thing. So these are some of the symptoms that somebody with schizophrenia might be experiencing. And if it's a decision that's never taken lightly, but if it's thought to be in the best interests of the patient and if they don't want to take medication, but it's thought in their best interests, and that's the safest and ultimately deemed as a necessary treatment, then you can enforce that. And that would be, I mean, I'd like to think it's more controlled and more safely done than what you see in the movies, but ultimately that is what sometimes would happen is, you know, you would force the medication, and the way that you would enforce the medication would be through, you know, people would control their arms and legs, and you would inject them with antipsychotic medication.
So does this medication make them normal, or does it make them almost like a vegetable where they just drool?
They can work very, very well. They can work so well that the experiences that they're having, they don't have anymore. You know, I've seen people's lives changed by these medications. And I believe in them. They can be very, very effective. They can be very, very effective to an extent that's hard to understand if you've not seen it happen. So I've seen people having these wild experiences where, you know, they might believe all sorts of things that aren't true. They might see all sorts of things that aren't there. They might hear things that aren't there. They might have, and that might make somebody really quite dangerous. So, for example, if somebody is hearing a voice telling them to hurt people, you know, that can happen. And these medications, they work, and they work very, very well. But they come at a price, and sometimes the price of that is that they can come with a lot of side effects, and so the side effects can cause people to gain weight. They can cause people to drool, as you've said.
Yeah.
They can cause people to have kind of Parkinsonian type side effects. So they might have like a tremor that they can't
Right.
get rid of, steppy feet, that sort of thing. They can cause issues with things like your libido and your sex drive and your sexual function.
Yeah.
And they can, even to the extent that they can cause longer term issues like diabetes and heart problems and things like that. So they're very, very serious. They're very, very serious medications.
And is male and female segregated, or are they together?
Segregated, yeah. Okay. Separate. So they might be within the same hospital, but you don't get mixed.
Yeah.
You don't get mixed wards. Certainly, I've never worked on a mixed ward. I have heard of them early in my career. I know that they existed, and while I was kind of very early in this, I had worked before I was in a permanent position. I would work like kind of, you know, a shift here, a shift there, that sort of thing, and they would be mixed sometimes. But typically they try and segregate the males and the females. As with all of healthcare, you know, it just comes with too many risks, you know. And
with so many inmates needing help and with limited resources, how do you prioritize?
Yeah, good question. I suppose you have to make a judgment call ultimately. I mean, these are questions that we come up with, that we address on a really regular basis. So, for example, you know, you might have your plans for who's going to be seen, and then all of a sudden a new person comes in, and that trumps everything. You know, it can be difficult. We make these decisions as a team, I suppose. For the most part, we make these decisions as a team. Certainly for new people coming in, and for risk incidents, we make these things as a team. In terms of my own work and my own caseload, it varies a little bit how often I see people. It goes between weekly and monthly, and I make those decisions based on kind of my interactions with them, what they think they need, how they're doing. Generally, it starts off more and then goes to less as I think it's safe enough and they're doing well enough to be able to do it. But yeah, sometimes you have to. Sometimes one of the things I've not mentioned in terms of the nursing available where I work is they do have a wing that's staffed 24/7 by nurses. So most of the people that I work with, they're just on regular wings. But if they are thought to need a greater level of input than I can manage on my own, then they might be nursed with a nursing team there 24/7. This is typically people who are being referred out to hospitals because they think it's not, they're too unwell to be in prison, or it's too unsafe, or that sort of thing. Then they'll be nursed 24/7 and they'll be referred out to a secure hospital of the sort that I used to work in.
So obviously you train BJJ, and does that growth and discipline and humility to BJJ, how does that, apply into your work with us?
I like to think it applies. I like to think it applies pretty well. It's a difficult job. It's a very testing job. It takes a lot out of you. That doesn't mean that everybody who's a nurse needs to train jiu-jitsu, but I do think it's really important that you have something in your life or things in your life that can help you overcome the challenges and the difficulties of the job. One of the things that they have as a kind of, I suppose, as a model of resilience and coping, they call it the five ways to well-being, and I can't remember what they all are now. It's things like physical activity, connecting to other people, learning things, being present in the moment, kind of like mindfulness and things like that. And one of the things about jiu-jitsu is it sort of hits all of these. Say if you were to treat them as targets to meet, it hits all of these, and I think the best activities do that in some ways. So it does give you a certain confidence, and not confidence like you're a hard man, but just it gives you a certain something. It's hard to define it really, I think, but there's something about it that makes you grow as a person and makes you be able to deal with difficulty. I think because it's so difficult itself, right?
Yeah.
And in my experience, it's the best way of coping with difficulty. So if if I'm rolling with somebody, and they're half my age and they're giving me a bit of a beating, and they've got their hand on the collar and they're about to choke me out, I'm not thinking about my day. Because I can't think about my day, right? There's something about being able to forget the things that are going on in your life and purely focus on the moment and what's happening right now. That's one of the skills they try and teach you in things like mindfulness, for example. Now jiu-jitsu will do that, and I think it gives you a community, a like-minded community. So like one of the things I really like is before we even get started, we're just all sort of sitting around talking, and it's 6:30 in the morning because we're doing the morning classes, and everyone would rather be in bed, but we're all still up anyway. Yeah. They're doing it, but there's something about that, right?
Yeah.
You sort of bond through the difficulty of the situation, and so I really like that. I get so much from that. I think it really helps me. It really helps me manage the challenges in the rest of my life, And I'm not somebody who switches off very easily. For me to switch off, I sort of have to switch on to something else, So I can't just, for whatever reason, I'm not someone who can just sit and chill, I like to be doing things.
I think it also makes you less anxious being around these potentially dangerous people. Yeah. Because, like you say, not thinking you're hard, but what you're capable of, and you also know limitations of people, especially people who don't train. Yeah. So it makes you feel a bit less.
I think it
more
also
calm in yourself.
I think also it teaches you your own limitations. So it really, there's plenty of people who think they're more physically capable than they are, but I'm very aware of my limitations because they get exposed to me all the time, right? Yeah. There's one or two people I can think of who hand my limitations to me every day, But there's something to that, I think, as well. It's not just about they say. What do they say? There's no losing. You win or you learn. And I think that as a philosophy is something that can be applied to lots of aspects of your life. So even in my working life, I feel like you win or you learn. In my relationships, you win or you learn. You can apply this to lots of things. If you go about it in the right way. And, not that I always manage that all the time, of course, but that's what I aim for, In all of the things that I do, I strive to either win or to learn, you know, and I think that's a philosophy that comes direct from jiu-jitsu. You know, that's one of the mantras they use, isn't it? You know? So I like to apply that to all areas of my life, you know, my working life, my relationships, and obviously also my physical life with jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, and I think jiu-jitsu is obviously a good way to wind down after a stressful day at work.
Would say, yeah, it is. It is. You
like
know,
you say, it takes your mind off of everything.
There's something about it, yeah, like in that moment, it's a strange thing, isn't it, though? Because in the moment, it's sort of hyper stressful. You know, obviously you've got some guy who's trying to break your arm, not actually trying to break your arm, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You know, we're simulating murder, aren't we? You know, you're trying to break someone's arm, you're trying to, you know, stop them from breathing. You know, those sort of things. It's so in that moment, that's not relaxing at all. But as soon as the round's over, or as soon as the class is over, you feel very relaxed. You feel very chilled. You feel good about yourself. You feel good about the people around you as well.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's something about that, and then I feel better about the rest of my life as well. You know, so whatever hardships you're going on in that moment during the class and in the aftermath of the class or the session, you know, for a short while, that they're all gone, they're all managed, you know.
And if you could introduce martial arts or movement programs into the prison, what would that look like?
Oh, I feel like the difficulty is martial arts can teach you lots of good things. You know, they can teach you discipline, they can teach you fitness, but they can also teach you how to really hurt people. And I don't see that being something that would get safely or be approved of or safe in the prison. Unfortunately, you know, we have people in the prison who are, you know, in for serious assaults or even for murder. Even if I was to introduce some sort of movement program, it would probably be something more like yoga or something like that.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean? You don't want to teach someone how to choke someone,
precisely,
kill them or whatever.
If somebody's, you know, unfortunately there can be a lot of fights in every prison, and you wouldn't want to get people who were really, really good at fighting, you know.
Make your job harder.
Precisely.
Then you get choked at training and at work.
Oh my gosh, yeah, and certainly the job of the officers and of everybody. And of everybody, there are programs. I think the charity based. It's called the Phoenix Trust. There are programs within some of the prison system for things like yoga, and I think it's not just about the movement, but also kind of the mindset and the management of stress and that sort of thing. There is also within the prison there is a gym program. So there's a gym there. You know, they have gym instructors. These are
oh wow,
yeah. So these are they're prison officers, but they are also qualified gym instructors.
Are any of the inmates on steroids? Because if you can get drugs in, I'm sure you can get steroids in.
I'm sure you can. It's not something you hear about a lot.
Okay.
It's not something you hear about a lot, but I suppose from our point of view, it might. I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised, but it isn't something that's like a big part of what we know about. I suppose one of the things within the mental health team, we hear about the things that impact us and come to our attention. So somebody using steroids and getting really big and strong isn't necessarily something that would come to the attention of a mental health team. It's possible though. There's a gym. It's a good gym. I mean, it's you know, it's you know, they've got weights, they've got machines, they've got like all the cardio equipment. You know, your rowers and your bikes and all of those kind of things. They do classes. It's really good. It's really good. And I think that is something that really ought to be promoted. You know, because again, you know, if you're all wound up and stressed, and prison is a stressful environment, you know, so that's a really, really good way. That's one of the ways in which the prisoners can manage their own stress. Certainly, is by use of the gym.
And have you seen a prisoner make a huge, you know, mental health like turnaround?
Yeah.
In a good way, and
I have. I've seen people. There are success stories. I suppose one of the things, because of the nature of the prison that I'm in, typically a success story means they move somewhere else. You know, they move to a lower category prison, or they'll get released, or that sort of thing. But within the prison system, you do see people make turnarounds. the kind of the paths to recovery or the paths to rehabilitation that they have within the prison system tend to be based around, they have courses, so there's a big psychology input, so it tends to be based around the courses, or it tends to be kind of vocational, occupational, so like work opportunities, that sort of thing, you know. And so I have somebody that I work with who works in the kitchens, and since he started working regularly in the kitchens, I barely see him, you know, because he's always working. Like, great, you know, I want him working, you know. I want him working. It's good that he does, and it's good that he can, and he probably gets more than he does from me, and that's perfect.
Now, 60% of inmates have brain injury in the mental health section.
I wasn't aware apparently of that as a statistic. Okay.
Yeah. So how do head injuries affect the mental health?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, I'm not an ABI specialist, so that's what they call it, ABI, acquired brain injury. Not my area of specialization, so it's not something I know too much about. I have to say I'm not too surprised by that. I mean, I imagine it comes about from things like fights. I can think of one person in particular that I worked with quite recently, not directly, but it's just somebody that I did a review on and then saw him a couple of times kind of in the aftermath of that, who it seemed like, certainly from reading the reports and from talking to him, his life was on a very different trajectory, let's put it, until he had a head injury as a teenager. I think it was a quad bike accident or something like that, and he's had a head injury, and then there was a real turnaround. And all of his offending history and his violent history, unfortunately, he was in for a violent offence, and there'd been quite a bit of violence in prison. And it seemed like all of this had happened. All of this had happened since his brain injury. Uh-huh. He was quite young, so he was in his early 20s. Had a brain injury as a teenager. Prior to that, hadn't been in prison at all, and there was a real turnaround. It's not my area of specialisation, but one of the things I do know about brain injury is that depending on what area of the brain is impacted, it can have a tremendous change in people's personality and in the risks. And I know a couple of people who, like I said, who I've worked with, who have had quite significant changes since a brain injury. I wasn't aware of that as a statistic. That's actually really, really interesting, and I can't say I'm surprised by that.
What's one thing the public continuously misunderstands about, mental illness and the treatment behind bars?
So I think there's a couple of things about that. I think the main thing that people misunderstand about people behind bars, so about offenders, particularly people with really serious offences, is that is just one part of who they are. So, for example, if somebody's in for murder, the initial conception, I suppose, that people often have, and I think this was probably the case for me too when I first worked in this field, is that you would just see them as that. So you would see them as this murderer, this dangerous people, this person who's done this terrible, deadly thing. But there's a whole person there. There's a whole life that they've had outside of that, and a whole person that they are outside of that. So this is just one aspect of who they are. People often ask me, "Oh, well, do you work with murderers, or are you not scared?" And actually, no, I'm not. And this isn't because of what I think about me. It's because of what I know about people like that. So there are so many people that I've had, I'll sit down and I'll talk to them, and they've done this thing, but that doesn't mean that that's all they are and that's all they're going to do, and that I'm suddenly at risk from them. Most risk situations or most dangerous things that people done, they're kind of situational. So it might be somebody first of all, most murders are committed against people that they know. So it could be like a family member or a friend or not a friend, like an enemy, I suppose. But it's somebody that they know. And so that particular person's at risk from them, but that doesn't at all mean that I am. So that's one of the things, I think, separating like the offence from the person. In terms of rehabilitation and in terms of specifically for mental health issues, I don't think it's something that's well understood in general. I think in terms of mental health, I think there's a lot more awareness of mental health, but I think the awareness that people have of mental health is very much on a lower not the serious mental health issues. So I think there's a lot more awareness of things like anxiety. There's a lot more awareness of depression. I don't think there's more awareness of what we call the SMIs, the serious mental illness. So things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or even like serious personality disorder, something like that. So sometimes you'll have somebody and they've done something really, really terrible and dreadful, and you'll hear people say, well, mental illness doesn't do that. But unfortunately, sometimes it does, you know, and that's something that I think is it's a lot less palatable and a lot less kind of easy to know about or to understand about. But that's something that I think that people don't have the same awareness. And it's hard to, because you don't want the perspective to be that all mentally ill people are dangerous, because that's not the case. But somebody's mental illness can make them do things that they would never otherwise do in 100 years. You know, if they think, for example, I need to kill this person before they're going to kill me, and none of it's real, but it can make somebody do that because they feel
or a voice told them
precisely, and they think they're fighting for their lives, you know, when they're actually not. But if you believe you're fighting for your life, that's what you're going to do.
So, you know, Charles Bronson, I mean, he's in prison for so many years. He's never murdered anybody. What is the reason they will keep somebody like that? You know, is it a mental health thing or what?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, he's life sentenced. So a life sentence means that you can only get out a parole board. So if I'm correct in this, he got life sentenced for an attempted murder. So most of his offending, he was a very prolific offender, and it was lots of kind of, you know, taking people hostage, climbing on top of roofs, that sort of thing. I don't think he is now currently in for any of those things. I think he's in now because he's life sentenced for an attempted murder, and so he can only get out a parole board. I don't know him well enough to talk more than that, but I know that he would only ever be released from a parole board. So my assumption is that the parole board don't think that he's yet safe to come out of prison.
And there was talks they were going to release him, but do you think that they will ever come? Or
I'm really not sure. I'm really not sure. I mean, he's an old man now. He must be in his 70s.
Yeah, I must imagine it's very hard for him now. If he comes out, he wouldn't know how to use social media.
Probably not.
Probably the internet, phones, driving.
Yeah.
You know, everything will be foreign to him.
I think he's the country's longest serving prisoner now. I think he's been in for about 40 years, something like that.
Oh yeah, I mean, how do you let somebody like that out into society?
Yeah.
I think it will be very hard for him.
Yeah, I think so.
You know, fast-paced life, all the internet and
I think,
technology.
I think this must be a real problem for lots of people who've been in for a very, very long time, because obviously the world's changing so quickly. And you do become institutionalized. The longer you were in a place, and the longer you were in within a certain system, a certain way of life, a certain, you know, those sort of things, the harder it is to live in any other way, you know. And the things that you need to survive and do well in prison aren't very applicable for the rest of the world. You know, it's a very, very different thing. It's a very, very different thing, and I can imagine this is a problem for lots of people who are life sentenced and are in for a very, very long time. You know, you might do, even somebody who's not done as long as that, you've done 15 years, you come out, the whole world's different, and then your options are very limited. Lots of places won't employ you if you've got a criminal record, for example. You know, it's really tricky. It's a real challenge, and I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't think there is a good answer.
So with the mental health patients, you know, or the inmates, are there any punishments like solitary confinement for anything they've done wrong, or are they being excused because of their mental health?
It varies a little bit. So some of the traditional punishments that you might hear about, like in prison movies, don't really apply now. Like, you don't put somebody in the box or the hole or something like that, but you do still have what they call segregation. Where you might be segregated from the rest of the prison because of your risks. That might be because of fights, it might be because of disruption to the prison, it might be from things like bringing drugs into the prison, for example. The mental health team have quite an involvement in that, actually. So anybody who goes onto segregation, they need to be cleared for suitability to be on there, that it's safe for them to be on there. And that asks, they call it an algorithm, so there's a number of questions that would be asked about that. You know, are they on mental health medication? Have they self-harmed? Do you think they'll be able to cope and manage on there? This could be passed or failed by the mental health nurse, depending on the assessment and how they see them. They typically pass, but they are often failed. One of the things that would automatically or make you more likely to fail it is if you thought somebody was really unwell. So if they were under the mental health team, you thought they were unwell. If they've been referred out to a secure hospital, like in the process that I described before, they would automatically fail being on segregation. It's very well known that being separated from everybody else is detrimental to mental health to anybody, and although it's solitary as in you're not out publicly the same time with other people, you've still sort of got people that you can talk to, but that tends to be on a professional level. So you'll get lots of people coming to visit you. So you'll get like a governor in the prison. You'll get somebody from the healthcare team, so it's either the mental health team or it's the GP team, and you'll get somebody from the chaplaincy team. The chaplaincy team sort of it's not just there for managing, helping people with their religious needs. They sort of work as like a pastoral support as well, kind of people's well-being and that sort of thing. So they get visited by people, they'll get seen by people, but it can be really detrimental. One of the things that you do also find on the flip side of that, I suppose, is you find people who actually prefer it because they like it. It's very clear what the expectations are. It's quiet because you're away from all the noise and all the kind of day-to-day hustle and bustle, and some people prefer that. Some people some people actually like to be on segregation because they know where they stand with things. Like you don't get many entitlements, but the entitlements that you have, you will get them, you know, whereas sometimes on a prison wing things are less predictable.
Can you be asked to place there, or is it a form of punishment to be segregated?
You can't be asked, so you can't be asked. It's a result of something that you...
So do they do something like fill somebody in just sometimes, in order to go there?
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, you get people who might do something specifically to get themselves segregated, and that might be violence, it might be disruption, like I don't know, a flood or a fire or something like that.
Kind of can't blame them, eh?
In some ways, because it depends. It's a very individual thing. It's a very individual thing because some people really dislike being on there and find it so hard, excruciatingly difficult. You know, if you're a really sociable person and the thing that helps you cope with prison is that social time, you're not getting that. But if you're somebody who copes better by, you know, being out the way and keeping to yourself and having a bit of peace and quiet, then you'll get that on there.
I bet some people feel that they're the only one who's not crazy in there.
Yeah, I bet that's a common feeling.
Yeah.
I feel that all the time. Not just in prison, just in my life. Yeah, I bet you do. I bet that's very common, and it's not a normal place. It's not a normal situation, you know. And so, like I said, the things that help somebody adjust to prison and do well in prison, they probably don't help you much elsewhere, you know, because it's such a unique place and it's not a normal place, right?
Yeah.
You know, it certainly won't help you, you know, live the rest of your life. You know, it's a very difficult adjustment to prison, but I am sure it's a really difficult adjustment out of prison as well.
Is there a moment in your career that still keeps you up at night or maybe give you hope?
I mean, there's one or two moments. They don't keep me up at night now, but they kept me up at night at the time. You know, risk incidents, people doing things to themselves, bad restraints that I've been in, fights that I've had to break up, those sort of things. They're very. People respond to really stressful, difficult situations in different ways. But I suppose this isn't not as a coping mechanism, but something that happens to me when I'm under stress. Is it impacts my sleep, you know? So that's a real challenge for me sometimes. And if you've got things on your mind or something that you think like, could I have done this? Could I have seen it coming? You know, that sort of thing. That can be really difficult. You know.
And how is the sex offenders dealt with on that wing? kept separated?
They're kept separate. There aren't, because of the nature of the prison I work in, there aren't very many vulnerable prisoners, as they call them, VPs. They tend to be, my understanding is they tend to be separate prisons altogether. So rather than it being a separate wing, it tends to be a separate prison altogether. The mixing really doesn't work at all, and there's been recently some very, very high profile incidents of where it's gone catastrophically wrong and people have died. You know, that's happened in the last 6 months. I think there's 3 high profile vulnerable prisoners who've been killed. You know, that's a matter of public record. So that's a really good demonstration of how badly it really can go wrong at its worst.
And where do they get weapons? Do they make it themselves, or is
they can make it? They might be made themselves. They might be made themselves. They might. That tends to be the main route, is that they get made, but in the same way that things can come into the prison. So that's something that can also sometimes come into the prison. They have what they call a dedicated search team. And so if there are any kind of suspicions of things like that, then you know, people's cells get searched, areas within the prison get searched, that sort of thing. You know, every reasonable measure to prevent it from happening, I think, is made by the prison, and that's something obviously nobody wants that. Well, obviously there are people who want that because they're bringing them in, but nobody who works for the prison wants there to be weapons in the prison. Obviously, you don't want that, and they do everything they can to try and prevent it. Like I said, in terms of the searching, but it can happen.
How do you maintain your own boundaries and mental wellness after witnessing so much trauma?
It's difficult. I suppose that comes with practice and with experience. In terms of managing your own boundaries, you get a lot of training for that sort of thing. As a nurse, you know, that's a big part of it. You want to have a therapeutic relationship, and that requires a certain amount of closeness for somebody to trust you, to be able to talk with them, for them to open up to you. But at the same time, obviously, it's still a professional relationship. It's not a personal relationship. One of the phrases they sometimes use in your training is, you know, be friendly but don't be their friends. I'm managing that. I think it's, whilst there are guidelines to these things, it's something that I think you have to kind of be mindful of and try and manage all of the time, because you really want to help people, but you also need to keep a line on things, and also, like, you aren't there all the time. You can't be there all the time. You know, you don't want to have it so that every time, this isn't even a loss of boundaries in terms of risk stuff, but you don't want it to be the case that anytime anything goes wrong, they call for you, and you're the first person they call for, because you're not there every day. You know, so that's something that you have to kind of try and make clear without it coming across as rejecting them. In terms of managing your mental well-being, some of the things we've already touched on that.
Yeah.
You know, you know, it's very important to have things outside of work. I think that's definitely not unique to mental health nursing, although we do witness and hear of an awful lot of trauma and difficulties in people's lives. I think lots of people have difficult, stressful jobs, you know, and difficult and stressful lives, and so the ways in which you manage that are some of the things that I've described. So, you know, your relationships, your family life, you know, your personal life, having things that you do. I think a lot of, on its most basic level, your personal well-being, I think, comes around from the people that you spend your time with and the things you spend your time doing. Certainly for me, you know, I'm not always the best with relationships, but you know, for me it's jiu-jitsu primarily.
Yeah.
That's my main thing for managing my well-being.
And what one change to policy or funding would change the prison mental health care tomorrow?
More staff. You know,
more staff.
Yeah, I would say so. Everywhere's short-staffed, and some of that is funding. Some of that, I think, is because it's such a tricky environment. You know, we have in the time that I've been there, there's been a couple of times where we've done real kind of pushes for staff. You know, like advertising it, I suppose, within the trust as like a place that you might potentially want to work to. Structurally, I think the prison isn't very well set up for mental health. And so I think the things, like I've touched on this already, but the things that would help are things to do, work opportunities, vocational things. Everybody needs things to do. So the things that I've described in terms of well-being, you know, in terms of, you know, who you spend time with and the things that you spend time doing. Sorry, the things that you spend. I'll start that again. So in terms of mental well-being, the things that I've described in my own life and that I think are important for everybody's life is, you know, who you spend time with and what you spend your time doing. So I think that also, it's not part of the program as much as maybe it could be. It's difficult because you have to balance that with stopping risks and, you know, managing risks. And so I feel like there should be more, they call them workshops, where you might learn to develop a skill, get a trade, that sort of thing. I think that's something that people really, really benefit from. But obviously also that creates certain risks because you might be using tools or, you know, potential weapons. So it's a real challenge. But I think that's one of the biggest things. I think also because mental health and mental well-being probably should be integral to everything in a way that it isn't necessarily. But I think that's something that is making a bit of a progression with on a societal level, is that there is more awareness of it, and hopefully that's something that can come through in the prison system as well. You know, I think there's efforts to do that, but I think that's a real challenge because there's so much to balance it against in terms of risk and danger.
Yeah. And after decades in this field, what keeps you committed, and where do you hope to see prison mental health, you know, care go in the future?
Yeah, I think what keeps me committed is because I really believe in it. I really believe in the necessity of it. I think that what we do is necessary and useful. It's tricky. I think being in a job long term is quite similar to being in a relationship long term. It's a little bit like a marriage, being in a job a long time, I think. And so, you know, it's not always rosy. You have your difficult spells, right? You know, and part of what strengthens a relationship sometimes is overcoming those difficult spells. And so I think one of the things that strengthens my relationship with my job is times when it's difficult and coming through it and having some sort of positive outcome. And also from that.
Rewarding when you see somebody do good.
So it's the best thing. Look, it's the best thing. It's the best thing when you see somebody, like when you see somebody who they need you less, you know, that's great. That's great. That's a positive outcome, right?
You know, it shows the rehab's working, and
it shows that it's working. You have people with all these kind of struggles. They're really suffering. They're really struggling, and through a combination of medication, through through potentially therapy, through the work that you're doing with them as a nurse, through the exchanges, the conversations, and then the things within the prison system. So maybe them getting a job or getting in a better position, getting onto a different wing, is wonderful to see. Sometimes the successes are harder to feel because often a success means that nothing's happened, and the fact that nothing's happened is a success. You know, when things are going badly, it's all this stuff. When things are going well, nothing's happening. Well, great, that's actually a real win. But it's harder to feel in a way because nothing's happened. You know, that's one of the things I think about. I think about our job. So I try and look out. For that. I think you really have to have an eye on the positive and look out for it. You know, it's very easy to get bogged down in this is wrong and that's wrong. But actually, you know, at the same time, we do a good job in a difficult environment. And I think that's we work. You know, that's the team. That's not me. I'm just one part of the team. You know, but we really work hard to get the best for these guys. You know,
great.
And that's what I want. You know, I want a challenge. I want, you know, I would get the same to work somewhere.
It's great.
Easier, you know, but that's not what it's about. That's not what it's about.
Yeah. And these people need people like you know, helping them. And is there anything else that you wanted to touch on today that we maybe didn't mention?
No, the thing that's the main thing for me, I think, is that the understanding of sort of more lesser, so to speak, mental health issues in terms of things like anxiety and depression. I think the understanding of that is a lot more than it was in terms of the major mental illnesses. I don't think there's the awareness yet, and a lot of that is because it doesn't touch people's lives day to day. You just hear a horror story every now and again, you know. And I think I don't know how you would create an awareness of that sort of thing. But that's something that I think that people just don't really know about or understand. It's a bit of a closed off world that sort of thing. And maybe for good reason. I'm not sure. You know, you don't want people to know about. It's very hard to create an awareness of that without, whilst maintaining people's dignity, because you don't want to suddenly go, well, look, this guy suffering in this way. You don't want people to see it. You need to obviously protect them.
Well, Pete, thank you very much for coming on to Dean Tyler podcast.
Yeah.
It was an absolute pleasure to have you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
And wish you all the best, with going forward and your job, and be safe and hope for good times and more good stories.
Yeah, you always hope for good times. You have to. What do they say? Hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
That's it.
Yeah.
Nice.
So that's what I do. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
If you enjoyed the episode, you know where to find me. Thank you. Cheers.